On to plant identification for monarchs and regal fritillary surveys. Part of this survey is a floristic assessment. We're looking at blooming plants. So that's why we're covering this. It's also nice in the introduction to get a little plant work in. But the plants that I'm going to talk about are those that were common in the last years of the survey. We have some that are grouped or lumped, like native thistles, and they're just under the title native thistles. I think we do the same thing with ironweeds. We have a couple species of ironweeds. We're not going to ask you to differentiate. They're just ironweeds. And you're probably going to see some other plants out there. So these are just the common ones that have shown up before. And we are going to hop right into our native thistles. We have, I think, 4 or 5 species, I can't remember off the top of my head, of native thistles. They have alternating leaves. They have really spiny leaves as well. I usually find a thistle by walking into it, especially the non-blooming ones. They have aster flower heads. They're largely purple, but there are some white ones out there. And the big way to tell the native thistles apart from the non-native thistles is that our native thistles have a white underside to the leaves. The non-native thistles are basically the same color, both top and bottom. Milkweeds we've talked about a little bit already, but we have quite a few in eastern Nebraska. They vary a great bit in size and shape. They have distinct horns and hoods for their flowers. There's not a lot of flowers out there that have this real milkweedy look. So once you see one, they're pretty easy to pick out from the rest of plants. They have white sap, except for butterfly milkweed, whose sap is clear. Common and world are heavily fed on by monarchs. We've documented that in this survey. Common is usually pretty tall and can be found in colonies. World is pretty short and spindly with very narrow leaves. You might run into dogbane. It also has a white milky sap, but its flowers lack the horn and hood that you see on milkweeds. So, and we are only looking at flowering plants for this, so that shouldn't be a huge problem. Lead plant is a shrub about 2 to 3 foot tall. It's pretty woody. Leaves are compound and they're a little bit gray. Bright purple legume flowers in pretty tight heads. You might run into false indigo bush, but it's usually quite a bit bigger and lives in wetter areas. Next is daisy fleabane. It's an aster flower with a yellow center and narrow white petals. It has simple alternate leaves with sparse hairs on the stem. Not everything that looks somewhat like this is a daisy fleabane. We also have annual fleabane. Annual usually has thicker leaves and more hairs. Plains coreopsis looks really delicate. Usually grows to 1 to 3 foot tall. I don't usually see them getting up to 3 foot probably. Yellow aster flower with a red base on it. Open-ended flowers are pretty distinct. They do have a pungent smell, so once you find one, give it a smell, and hopefully you can maybe ID your plants by smell next time. Black-eyed Susan are another yellow aster flower. They have a dark purple center. Leaves are alternate with stiff white hairs along the margins, and the stems also have those hairs. There are many sunflowers out there. And this is a good time for me to say that if you're unsure on any of your ID, if you're not 100% on any of the ID, just take some pictures of it and we will ID it for you. We have yellow and white sweet clover. They're pretty spindly looking plants, but they do have usually large amounts of flowers kind of clustered together. Differentiated by their color, yellow and white. Then we have our white and purple prairie clovers. They have compound leaves like most of the peas, tight oblong flower heads with many individual flowers. White is white and purple is purple, in case you had to guess. They also have a pungent odor if you would rub the leaves. Black medic is another clover. It sprawls out pretty wide. Leaves are three-parted and faintly toothed. You can maybe see that in some of these pictures. They have a tight yellow legume head, and they are on the smaller side for leaves of most clovers. Then we get into the two clovers you probably think of when you hear clover, red and white clover. Red clover is generally more pink or purple than a true red that I would think of as red, at least. The leaves on red clover are more elongated than that of white clover, which are a little more circular and are probably what you think of most when you hear the word clover. There are a few clover lookalikes. Each year I have to ask what alfalfa is. It looks just enough like the rest of the clovers that it throws me off. I know it's not one of our common species, but it has more purple flowers usually found in kind of bunches. Then we have bird's foot trefoil. If you get up close to them, it doesn't look quite so much like a clover, but from a distance, it might give you pause. Next, we'll move on to Hoary vervain. Grows up to about 1 meter tall. The stems are square with coarse opposite toothed leaves. The plant is very hairy, 1 to several spikes of light purple flowers, as you can see here. The flowers are not regular. They usually are going up the plant, blooming kind of upwards. Mints also have square stems and purple flowers. We don't see a ton of mints. We have seen a reasonable amount of American germander. We've also seen a little bit of purple loosestrife and blue vervain. Both of these are generally found in wetter areas though. So if you see what you think might be hoary vervain and it's a little damp, give it a double check, especially if it's wetter. Next is ironweeds. We have Western and Baldwins. You don't need to differentiate that. They have alternate toothed leaves, purple aster flowers. They usually bloom a little later into our butterfly surveys as well, but you might see them growing without flowering yet. Not quite at the start of the season, but by July probably. Lastly, we have Western Yarrow. The heads are white aster flowers, feathery, like fern-like leaves almost, are very distinct, and again, this species has a pungent odor as well. If you're interested in plants, our botanist recommended these 3 field guides. I personally prefer the field guide to wildflowers of Nebraska and the Great Plains. It is sorted by flower color. So if you have a white flower, you just skip to the white flower section and you thumb through until you find one that you think looks like it. Weeds of the Great Plains and grassland plants of South Dakota and the northern Great Plains are a little denser read and not quite as handy to look up individual flowers, especially if you have no idea where to even start.